Hello, welcome back to some more Hearthstone patch notes. This is patch, I think, 30.2.2. A patch which had a few nerfs in it. Actually had some stuff to Wild, which we'll cover at the very end of it. I'm not a big Wild player, so I'll just gloss over those at the end. There was a bunch of Battlegrounds changes, which again I'm not going to deal with because I don't play Battlegrounds, and then a bunch of standard changes. 2 nerfs, I think, and then something like 12 or 13 buffs. Thereabouts. More buffs than nerfs is what I'm getting at. Now, before we delve into this, I just want to talk about the current state of Hearthstone. And to do this, I'm going to use two things. Firstly, I nabbed some snaps off Cards Realm, HearthstoneCardsRealm.com. Recently, we had a Summer's Masters Tour for Hearthstone, and the 5 most brought decks were Overheal Priest, Miracle Rogue, Insanity Warlock, Handbuff Paladin, Tempo Druid. They were the big 5 ones. I believe this is the records and win rates, but it's hard to read into this fully at a tournament because of the way the pecking and the counter picking works. Also worth noting, just behind those decks was like Rainbow Death Knight, Concierge Druid, Evolved Shaman. I believe also some people brought like a Cycling Rogue deck out there as well. But that gives you an idea of some of the best decks out there, because the best players are playing these decks. Possibly worth noting as well, and I'll just delve into this now as well. If you want to HS replay, and this is not the premium version, so it only goes up to Diamond, these are the current win rates of the classes in Standard. Now, Rogue is right at the bottom, but I will say, this Miracle Rogue deck has an unbelievably high skill ceiling, and basically, unless you're in the top 1,000 players or so in the game, this deck has a pretty poor win rate. But if you get to that top 1,000%, 1,000 players, sorry, it suddenly elevates very high. So it's a pretty high skill ceiling deck, and very, very strong if you can play it to its fullest. Priest is also pretty low down on the list, but I just got a funny feeling that not many people are playing the Overheal Priest at lower ranks. And then the Paladin, Warlocks, Shamans, Death Knights that we saw at the Master Swords are taking up the top spots, and Druid for that matter. Now, there are 4 classes I think that are a little bit underwhelming right now. They are Demon Hunter, Hunter, Mage, and Warrior. They didn't really get anything brought to the Master Store, nor are they doing particularly well on the ladder. So you're expecting to see the buffs there, and the nerfs to hit some of the other classes instead. I was hoping stuff would hit Paladin. Anyway, by the by, the first thing that was nerfed was Tidepool Pupil. This card has been seeing a lot of play in many, many decks. It was a 1 mana card, it's now a 2 mana card. I actually forgot 1 circle in this, it also got 1 health on top of it, so it got a nerf and got a buff at the same time, so it got 1 additional health as well. I think overall, though, this is a nerf. Basically, doubling the mana of a card, increasing its mana by 100% is so, like, crazy for a card, especially when you get down to, like, 0 mana and 1 mana cards, because there's normally ways to do some cheating with the fact that they are very cheap minions or very cheap spells in the case of spells. Full of Tidepool Pupil is seeing play. I believe it's seeing play in Insanity Warlock. I think it's definitely seeing play in Overheal Priest. I think it's definitely in the Rogue deck as well. And I've got a funny feeling that this is going to hit that Miracle Rogue deck really, really hard. I'm actually not fully aware of the combo. The combo is like an infinite combo where you get infinite damage via Grifter, I think, and some other potential cards along the way, which is why it's quite high skill ceiling, because you can sometimes discover other ways to infinitely kill your opponent. Anyway, I don't know if Sonya ever copied this Tidepool card in that deck. Obviously, it could do before, it can't now, and this 2 mana threshold is pretty bad for Rogue, because they can't discount by 1 very easily. So I think it's going to be a pretty bad nerf to that Rogue deck, and already, like, it was pretty low win percentage unless you were in, like, the top 1,000 players. It probably gets to the point where, is it worth playing it anymore? I don't know. Overheal Priest, which is also pretty strong, was playing it, but they're probably more tolerant for this 1 mana increase, as they played it more as a value card than rather as part of a combo. I'd expect this to also hit Concierge Druid pretty hard, because they normally play the Tidepool Pupil mid-combo to get them more chalices, to pew-pew your opponent a little bit more, so overall, this is going to be a pretty big nerf to the card. I still think it's really strong, but it definitely pulls it more towards like a value-generating card than something that can set up a 1-turn combo card, which I think is a fine change for it. Actually, also worth noting on this card, Naga Demon Hunter wasn't particularly strong, at least by the ratings. It really hits that deck pretty hard, though. It's a key card in Naga Demon Hunter, so unfortunately, if you're a Naga Demon Hunter lover and it's like their major deck, this is a pretty big nerf to that deck as well. But don't worry, they have buffs coming up later on. The other card that was hit, and this was the second card that was nerfed, was Doomkin. Doomkin got a 1 mana increase. Again, I put my green circles on this. It also got 1 attack and 1 health. This is actually a fairly big nerf to it, but it doesn't really solve the underlying issue of Doomkin. The real painful thing about Doomkin is when it's running a deck with Dorian, the opponent plays a Dorian on the board, they play a Summer Child, they draw 2 cards that cost 5 or more. Invariably, one of them hits Doomkin. It doesn't always hit Doomkin, but it can hit Doomkin. And then you get 1 mana, 1/1, steal an opponent's mana crystal. That is really, really, really obnoxious. It is giving you ramp and also negatively ramping your opponent. It's basically giving you 2 mana crystals, at least net compared to your opponent. So this doesn't really change that fact. Now, I will say, ramp gets worse and worse the closer and closer you're getting to 10, because obviously as soon as you hit 10, you don't need the ramp anymore. And going to 7 mana, that means that if you draw this card at any other point, you basically have to play this card on 7, 8. Yeah, basically 7 or 8 to really get any big value from it. Because on 9, you would have just ramped up to 10 naturally anyway. So there's basically now a 2-turn window to play this card without cheating it with Dorian. It's probably a big enough change to see a noticeable difference, but I still think you'll probably still run this in the deck with Dorian, just for that chance to get the 1 mana 1/1 variant of it, which you still will get, and Summer Child can still pull this card out as well. So definitely a nerf. Definitely going to lower the win potential just playing the native card, but it's still pretty obnoxious, this card, in my opinion. Alright, now we're going to get to the buffs. And firstly, we're going to deal with the Demon Hunter buffs. CCG. Was a 4 mana 4/3 Death Rattle get 3 random first edition Demon Hunter cards in mint condition. AKA it was before they were nerfed, because when Demon Hunter was released, when was it, 2019? It was Ashes of Outland, right? It was released. Anyway, a bunch of the cards got nerfed, so this was the pre-nerf state of those cards. Now, CCG has 1 more health. 1 more health! Oh, but they've also, butchered the effect. No longer is it a Death Rattle. It is now a Battlecry, Outcast, and Death Rattle. You get a random first edition Demon Hunter card. This, overall, in my opinion, is a nerf. It's a pretty big nerf as well. So what, you get 1 additional health. You're still understated for a 4 mana card. That doesn't really matter. And actually, you wanted lower health on a Death Rattle card because you want your minion to die normally, because the Death Rattle is often better than the minion. Sometimes that doesn't work that way, but in general, the Death Rattle cards, similar to Battlecry cards, the stats get understated because the effect is really good. CCG was a 4 mana 4/3 that drew 3 cards, so to speak. It wasn't quite draw because, it was the random cards you're getting from Demon Hunter, so you didn't really know what you were getting. But I will say, it's not much better getting random cards from Battlecry, Outcast, and Death Rattle. It's probably going to mean that you're not going to get 3 cards anymore. It's going to be fairly infrequent that you're going to get the Outcast, so you're going to have to be lucky to get the Outcast. And you still have the Death Rattle on it, so you could argue if this gets silenced in any way, this could be seen as 4 mana 4/4, get a random card, which obviously in Standard is unplayable. But I think even at 4 mana 4/4, get 1 random card now and 1 random card later, because this is the potential advantage is Battlecry and Outcast is faster than Death Rattle, but it's more hoops to jump through for the Outcast. I think all in all, this card is worse than it was before. It didn't see play in any decks anyway, at least in Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3, so it's going to make absolutely no difference to Demon Hunter. So Demon Hunters, you're going to have a sad time. But don't worry, we also have Hunter buffs. Mystery Egg. Used to be a 5 mana 0/3 miniaturized card. Death Rattle got a copy of a random beast in your deck. It costs 5 less. Now it has 1 mana reduction, and it costs 4 less. Hand Wavy. This is also a nerf, not a buff. Now, I will say, I think it actually does work out as a buff when you really, think about the way that the game of Hearthstone is played. Just as, a raw, looking at this card, you have to remember that, sure, this is 5 mana with a 5 mana discount on it, but the miniature was 1 mana with a 5 mana discount on it. Now it's 1 mana with a 4 mana discount on it, so the mini is being nerfed pretty bad. It's a pretty bad nerf to the mini. What I will say, though, is this makes you do your Mystery Egg combo faster. I believe this is seen playing the deck that's being, fondly called Breakfast Hunter right now. The idea is you play your Mystery Egg on board, and then on a subsequent turn or on the same turn, depending on how confident you are that the egg will survive, you play a Yelling Yodel, you get 2 beasts drawn that costs, it used to be 5 or less, and you'd get stuff like Hollowhound, you'd get stuff like Muckler, you'd get stuff like King Plush, And it would just be a huge amount of mana cheat. You'd also run the cleave cards in there, like the Absorbing Parasite and always a bigger Yourmonger and the Bestial Madness to give your minions big buffs. And eventually you would just be able to put down ginormous beast after ginormous beast and just basically swamp your opponent from there. Obviously, the big disadvantage of this before was it just took too long for the combo to go off right. You'd play your Mystery Egg maybe on 5, hope your opponent didn't kill it, play your Yodeler on 6, you would draw 2 cards, and you could draw the Holohound and play it on that turn, but some of the other ones you might not be able to play, like the Plush I don't think you could play after this combo, so you could get slightly screwed in that regards. Things don't really change when you go to the 4 mana 4 less, because, you know, the mana cheat on the egg is mirrored on the mana cheat of the card, if you get what I mean, aka 1 mana less, 1 mana less. Balance that equation, it works out nicely. Anyway, it still gets the same discounts, but you can play the egg 1 turn sooner. So rather than waiting to 5 and then Yodel and 6, you can play the egg on 4 and Yodel on 5 instead, and then play your super cards probably on 6 instead with the buffs. It might allow you to live long enough to live through the aggression of something like a hand buff Paladin deck, or even the Overheal deck can put out quite a lot of pressure as well. I don't think it's going to matter. I don't think it's going to make a huge difference. I still think this is going to be too slow, too much setting up, and then generally speaking, the other disadvantage of this deck is you don't want to put any other beast in it other than a giant beast, which sort of limits your early game and what cards you can put in there, and you generally just want to survive through your early game and then tutor for these cards that you need, like the Yelling Yodeler and the Mystery Egg. So you end up running stuff like tracking and stuff in the deck. I just think it's a little bit too slow, a little bit too inconsistent to matter. So I think overall, even though the miniature egg is... The mini egg, sorry, of course. The mini egg is worse. I think just because you can do this 1 turn sooner will make the Breakfast Hunter slightly better, but I don't think it's going to put it into like tier 1 range at all. Furious Fowls also got a buff. It's no longer summoning 2/3/2 birds, they're now 2/3/3 birds. It's effectively +2 health on the minions, because, you know, it's 3 2 times 2 subtracted from the 3 3 times 2, aka it's 6 minus 4, aka 2 health. I think this doesn't matter. I think it's completely irrelevant. The card is too slow. Hunter basically doesn't have a reason to have a big single target spell like this. Priest that could also run this also probably wouldn't run Furious Fowl as their big single target removal. I think it's just completely irrelevant. The card is kind of flawed just because of the meta it's in. And by the way, the meta it's in has a lot of good AoE damage right now. Overheal Priest and Insanity Warlock are very good at doing big amounts of AoE damage to clear off minions from the board. And Furious Fowls would just get killed during the process of that. They also don't have necessarily lots of big giant minions that you absolutely have to clear. Obviously that's not true. Every deck has a minion that you have to clear because, you know, decks run good cards, right? But funnily enough, Amanthal or something like that's in Overheal Priest that you might want to kill has 7 health, and the Fowls would not kill it. So there's just better ways for Priest to kill cards. I think Hunter would be more aggressive than that, or they'd do this combo deck to get out insane giant beasts instead, which they could then Strangleheart back, later. I think the card is just flawed, so I think this is an irrelevant change, but it's certainly a buff. Fetch has got a 1 mana discount. This brings it way more in line with something like Dig for Treasure in Rogue. You could argue it's better, because Dig for Treasure, you get a coin if you draw a pirate. For Fetch, if you get a minion and it's a beast, you get a spell, and probably a spell is better than a coin. That is a semi-hand-wavy thing, though, because coins are very good in Rogue. They have Wishing Well decks, and they have a lot of combo cards as the Rogue core mechanic. Do I think the 1 mana reduction is going to make Fetch see play? No. For part of the same reason that I don't think it would see play, because Dig for Treasure is not really seeing any play in Rogue right now, and Rogue has a big pirate support. I just don't think there's enough good Beast Hunter decks out there, and the best Beast cards for Hunter are the big beasts, and you don't want to draw the big beasts, that's your patches. You want them in your deck to cheat them out with your eggs. This is a card, though, that I think is for the future. If they release a lot more beast support, we have had plenty of archetypes in the past that are Beast Hunter. Fetch is now 1 mana, draw 2 cards if all the minions in your deck are beasts. So I do see a world where Fetch will eventually see play, but I just don't think it will matter for the current meta. Now we get to Rogue. Now, as I mentioned, Rogue is like very low down at the lower ranks, but at the very high ranks is very high up. So it's a little bit hard to deal with rogues right now. They also have some issues because of the existence of Sonya. That it's hard to print a card that is good for 1 mana, 3 mana, 4 mana, I think that's it in Rogue because of being able to discount cards by 3 mana and 2 mana via Shadow Step and the pirate whose names I've forgotten now. Eudora isn't in one of these brackets. It's been pulled down to 5. It still requires you to play 3 cards from other classes to complete the quest. You get amazing loot, which is treasures from like the jewels and stuff from the past. Do I think this will matter? No, because it just won't work. Burgle Rogue will never ever work because generating random cards is inherently random. And it's much better to put cards in your deck that synergize with the other cards in your deck. So I don't think it's worth playing an understated 5-drop minion to get some treasures, some of which, by the way, the treasures, you might argue are weaker than cards that just exist in Standard right now. Time has moved on, Eudora. Your treasures of the past now are junk. We have modems, we have computers. Get with the times, Eudora. It's a fun card. I can see some more fun decks coming from this with like tests and stuff like that. Some sort of Value Rogue deck. But Value Rogue never works, and I don't think it'll work now. Nor do I think it'll work with Maestro, which also was buffed. It received a 1 mana discount. It is still a 5 mana 6/5 that generates a card. It is a discovered card. That is basically a semi-understated, or it's pretty close to like the average statting you'd expect for a minion that discovers a card as its effect. That's basically an arena card. I still don't think this will see play. Obviously, the dream of Maestro is that you change your class into a different class, that your rogue cards become cards from other classes, so that when you play Test, you can bounce it around, for example, and bounce Test back to your hand, and get infinite value. It won't work, though. It's just too slow. The game is too fast now. You have to deal with boards of ginormous Paladin minions that have Divine Shield, and Rogue can't do that. So, and actually, funnily enough, the Infinite Rogue deck, which is really strong right now, part of the reason that's really hard to play, and some of the reasons why it loses, is it struggles with the aggression somewhat, so you have to make sure you're discovering the most appropriate cards to deal with your opponent's deck at any one time, because you do not have a lot of answers to board states. So I just think Rogue, not that it's bad, I think the issue with Rogue right now is Rogue seems to always have like this 30 card list which is giga broken. And then outside of that, it's just hot trash. So if any time that 30-card list like breaks in some way, Rogue just falls over for a little while. And I think that may be close to what is going to occur right now in Rogue. But fun cards, I'd like to see them played more. A card I actually think maybe does see a little bit more play now is Metal Detector, though. That I've ringed the wrong thing. I was asleep. By the way, I'm going on holiday fairly soon, like within 12 hours, so... forgive me if I've not got the full quality on this yet. It's not a mana increase, it's an attack increase on the weapon. I've accidentally circled the wrong thing. This being a 3-attack weapon, it makes it more reliably able to kill opponents' minions, which means you're more likely to get coins. Rogue has a bunch of coin decks out there. For example, you have the Miracle Paladin Rogue deck, where you try and use the card name that I've forgotten the name of, Linessa. You can use Linessa to do like 30 damage via spells. It's very inconsistent. It suffers against aggro. I don't think it'll work. It was also seeing a little bit of play in Earthen Paladin, which was like teching into Rogue slightly to use some of their Rogue cards, which allowed you to cast cards from other classes. AKA, you could play Paladin cards in your... Sorry, you could get non-Rogue cards casting twice, which is pretty good in your Paladin deck, because they are non-Rogue cards. And for Earthen Paladin, it's a lot of value if you potentially cast these Earthen generating cards twice. Metal Detector did see a little bit of play in that deck to generate you coins to try and ramp into these big combos sooner. Also, it's just good to deal with opponents' boards. So I actually think maybe this sees a little bit more testing. I don't think Wishing Well Rogue is going to be good enough. It's still just very inconsistent. But yeah, I think this is a step in the right direction for this card. Now we get to Warrior, and I have some issue with the Warrior cards. Firstly, Rycleaver. The minion's damage is 1 cheaper. Irrelevant. The card should never be meta. I think this is a really, really poorly designed card. If this card is ever meta, the game state is really boring, because it will be whoever draws Rycleaver faster wins. That is not a healthy board, not a healthy state for the game to exist in. Big issue with Rycleaver is, if Rycleaver ever gets strong, you will run Weapon Destruction in your deck, because if you ever Rustrat Viper the Rycleaver, you win! Because your opponent has played 5 mana, get a 4/2 weapon, which is a big loss of mana. Now, obviously, when it was like 7 mana, this was a bigger deal. It's less of a deal at 4/2 weapon for 5 mana, but it's still pretty bad. I don't think the issue with this card right now is that the minion sandwich is too expensive to play afterwards. I think the issue with this card is it's just too goddamn slow. Games aren't getting towards, you know, like hell, games aren't getting beyond like 8 mana sometimes. They're like really quick at times. And you need to play a Ride Cleaver on 5. You then have to fill your hand with cards, which you can do with certain cards, but there's not a lot of good, you know, hand-filling cards. And most of those hand-filling cards mean you're not doing anything to the board state, aka your opponent is just smoking you in the face. And that is big owies. And eventually, what is your reward? You play a bunch of minions from hand which won't get their battle cries. It's just a nonsense. The only way this really works is if you're cheating out huge stats and getting a huge mana cheat on it. I think it's just going to be super, super hard to balance it. And I personally don't think they should balance it. I think it should just be a meme card that exists in the standard set, and eventually in 2 years' time, it will be removed from the standard set, and no one will remember its name. Yeah, I don't think it matters. I think it's somewhat irrelevant. We also have Food Fight, another card that I'm not a huge fan of. Food Fight has had its entree reduced from a 0/6 to a 0/4, so it's easy for you to destroy the entree. Is it, though? Is it really easy for you to destroy the entree? I was actually thinking about this a little bit. If you're going to destroy the entree, you're probably going to be doing it on turn 4. Like, assuming you play this on curve, and you get the most value from this card where you cheat a minion from your deck when you play this on curve and kill it on curve. Because otherwise, if you're playing it on 8, you might as well play the big minion anyway without the Food Fight. You're just losing the battle cry. No? On 4, your most likely ways to kill this card were Shield Slam and Char. Shield Slam may have actually done 6 damage. You never know. There's lots of good ways to get big amounts of armor in Warrior, especially as early cards. So I think it's pretty reasonable to assume that Shield Slam by turn 4 could have done 6 damage. Obviously, it can more consistently do 4. Char does 7. It would have killed the 6 cost anyway. And this combo wasn't good enough to see play before. Then I got thinking more. Is there any card in the game that is a 4-mana card that deals specifically 4 damage? There is. It's Rowdy Partner. So we've moved Food Fight into a scenario where Rowdy Partner can consistently kill it, which it couldn't do before. Fantastic. Would you run Rowdy Partner in your Food Fight deck? Absolutely no, you wouldn't. Because you might hit Rowdy Partner with your Food Fight, which would be an awful, awful result. So again, I was like thinking about this a little bit more. This like whole machination reminds me of Big Priest from the past, where you would run a bunch of big minions in your deck and then cheap spells to let you live until you could play the cheating cards that could get your big minions out. One of the big ones was a card called Barnes, which I think at the time was 4 mana, not 5 mana. And you summoned a random 1/1 copy of a minion from your deck. Now, you'd normally put Yashiraj in your deck, which would, at the end of the turn, summon a minion from your deck. This effect is insanely good, because you would get the full stat cost of the minion that went onto your board, and you'd run a bunch of things like Ysera, and I think they ran some like Taunt Death Rattle cards. And then one of these cards died, like the 1/1 died. You would play Eternal Servitude to discover the card to resummon it, and you would pick Yashiraj, and you would get your 10/10 Yashiraj back. Bearing in mind you're doing this around the turns of like 5 to like 6 or 7. That was disgusting. That was sometimes a really, really big deal. A lot of decks couldn't deal with that. Just sheer vomiting of stats, and you would lose. I will say, though, that big Priest deck, I don't think ever really got to tier 1. I think it was somewhat inconsistent, because you kind of need to draw Barnes. And there was also I can't remember exactly what the spell was called anymore, but there was a spell that summoned a 5/5 copy of a minion in your deck. And all the minions in your deck had really good aura-like effects or death rattle effects. So it was fine whichever one you cheated out, you'd get some pretty big value from it. Anyway, they had like 3 cheating cards and had a couple of ways to resurrect. I think there was also additional ones on top of it, Eternal Servitude eventually. I don't remember, it's further down the line. Anyway, I think this is like the deck pattern they're going for with this Food Fight combo. Now let's go to what Warrior has potentially. They have Food Fight, that replaces Barnes. Barnes at the time was 4 mana, I believe, and was very consistent because it was a battle cry, not something like Food Fight where you give something to your opponent. You probably were going to wait a turn to kill it, because let's be real, you're not running cheap minions in the deck. You're not going to have a board before your Food Fight, because your Food Fight has to hit big minions, so you're going to bastardize your deck in such a way that it only has cheap spells. I say cheap spells. It has cheap spells filling up the early game and then just ginormous minions at the end game. So you're guaranteed to cheat out a big minion with your Food Fight. You do not want 1 or 2 drops in your deck, because then you're paying 3 mana, jumping through hoops to get a 1 drop, which is not good value. So you're going to have to like sort your deck out to give yourself a food fight, which your opponent could then do something to. They could potentially silence it if they're running a silence card. They could bounce it if they're a rogue and put it into your other hand. And you would basically have done 3 mana do nothing. That's not cool, right? So immediately, food fight is weaker than what Barnes was. Then I jump to the other end of the spectrum. Eternal Servitude allowed you to discover a minion that died this game for 4 mana and summon it. The best warrior has in this type of deal is actually in Druid, but you could tourist into it and get Hydration Station. You don't get to discover, but it's tutoring for taunt minions in particular, and you could put some big taunt minions in your deck. For example, Monstrosity, which also can generate another card, a bit like Yashiraj could do, where it generated you some more value. Overall, though, it just doesn't quite work as well as the deck that worked from the past. The Hydration Station is going to just take longer to come up online. Yashiraj is better than Monstrosity, debatably, depending on what the deck is that you're going to run as a whole. And Food Fight is just really inconsistent. Also, on the side of Food Fight, the other then card you'd probably be running in this deck to cheat out a giant minion is something like Chemical Spill, which does 5 damage to the minion. And we did see this deck working with the Unkill Axes. You'd probably also have Unkill X in your taunt pool. But I just think it's not going to be consistent enough. It takes too long to get to the Hydration Station versus Eternal Servitude. And honestly, the game has moved on in both ways. I think the aggression is more aggressive than it was in the past. And I think one of the things that really hurt Big Priest was just going super aggressive versus it. And the Priest kind of having to survive through these like first 4 or 5 turns. And I think Warrior has a similar issue where they don't have great cards to survive through the early game, especially since Control Warrior was nerfed so heavily recently. Especially all of its spells. It's just a real like pain in the ass to survive until you're getting off like your big cheating cards like Chemical Spill and your Food Fight. So I think it's somewhat irrelevant. Also worth noting with Food Fight as well in terms of like destruction. One of the nice cards to destroy was Blade Storm, and the needle hasn't moved that much with Food Fight being a 0-4 versus 0-6. Blade Storm would have killed both. Now I will say that it's more likely your opponent minions will have 4 or more health than 6 or more health. So Blade Storm might hit the Food Fight and their minions at the same time. Yeah, I don't see it. I simply do not see it. Also in Warrior Land, the Boom Wrench was buffed. It has a 1 mana discount on it. Irrelevant. Completely and utterly irrelevant. Who thought of this change? I just don't understand it. Normally a 1 mana discount is a pretty big deal. And, you know, it is nice that it comes up 1 turn early. Very nice. The big question, though, with the Boom Wrench is, obviously you're playing the Boom Wrench because of the effect of the card. Triggering a Death Rattle of a friendly minion, and it has to be a mech, is pretty strong, right? Okay, what is the card you would normally cheat? Normally, you would cheat at 5, Fireworker, or more realistically, a mech you would cheat out with Chemical Spill that has a really good Death Rattle and cost more. They are the things you're doing on turn 5. So it was fine to play the weapon on 4, because you could break it on 5. Fantastic. Great work, everyone. So, what has changed? Well, now I could do something to a mech on 4. Is there a mech in the game that has a Death Rattle on 4? Yeah, it's Replicating Menace. It just doesn't matter. Like, why would you take 1 mana off this card when all you're going to do anyways, if you play this on 3, you're going to have to not swing on one of your turns because you want to swing on 5. So either you play this as a 3 mana 3/2 and don't swing on that turn, or you play the 3 mana 3/2, you swing on that turn, but you can't swing the turn afterwards because you want to wait to 5 to get the Fireworker. It's ill-conceived, man. It just doesn't make sense. It would make more sense to make the weapon a 4/2 for 4 instead, so you can destroy something more reliably on turn 4, or put some more pressure on your opponent's face. There's just nothing that would slot into that 4 gap for you to discount the mana to try and Death Rattle a minion on 4. It doesn't make sense, okay? It just doesn't make sense to me. Now we get to some mage cards. We have Rayla the Sand Sculptor. She got 1 health. Irrelevant. Just completely irrelevant. She is going to be more likely to survive. The problem is that Mage doesn't have particularly good cheap spells right now, and Paladin has some good cheap spells, but they have just a super deck in the form of Handbuff Paladin that I don't think this would supersede regardless. So I think the 1 health change is nice, but won't matter at all. I'm actually going to get back to that one in a moment as well, because Marooned Archmage, another card that might see play in this archetype, which was a 3 mana 3/3, the first spell each turn you cast costs 2 less, has got 1 more health. Also somewhat irrelevant, because this card, if it was going to see any play, would see play because the effect is really good. It's effectively a 1-mana 3/3, right, if you cast a spell that costs 2 or less on that turn. Herein lies the problem, though. Mage doesn't have many good spells that are 2 or less. Paladin has a few, but it's not as good as, like, just running Handbuff Paladin, which runs no spells. So I think it's somewhat irrelevant that this has 1 additional health. I don't think this is living for another turn, regardless of having it 1 more health. Other things worth mentioning is if you're going to have this rapid fire spell, paladin, or mage deck out there, what are your payoffs? Because you need more payoffs other than just Railer. Now, one of them you might want to run is Dark Moon Magician, which is actually a little bit risky because there are some game-ending cards printed at, like, spells specifically printed at around 3 costs. For example, the Warlock one, Announced Darkness, whatever it's called, or Renounced Darkness. One of the other. It's Announced, right? Announced Darkness. That card is just, you lose the game if you cast it. So I think it's too risky to cast random spells right now that are fairly cheap. Yeah, I don't think it'll make a difference. Oh, and then finally, Watercolor Artist. Oh, no, not finally. Second from last, Watercolor Artist has a 1-mana discount and also lost 1 stats to both attack and health. Semi-irrelevant. The only reason that Watercolor Artist, I believe, is seeing that much play right now is in Sith, Rainbow Mage, where you can get buy one, get one freeze discounted to a 0-cost card eventually, and then you play your 0-cost card on your Sith to duplicate it to give you a big amount of spell damage to OTK your opponent with the remaining 4 mana via spell damaging spells. Does it matter that the Watercolor Artist comes 1 turn sooner? Yeah, it probably means that you can play your Sith turn 1 turn sooner, which matters in this smorgasbord of aggression, that you could get your OTK off 1 turn sooner. So I don't want to immediately say this is a bad change. I mean, I don't think it is. I think it's definitely a buff. I don't think it's going to be big enough, though, to make the Rainbow deck see play, because you're probably still needing to get to around 10 mana crystals to get your combo wombo off. At the very least, you're going to need, like, 9. And also, in the process of doing all of this, you need to cast a spell from every single spell school. It's just going to be simply too hard to do. So, yeah, I think this deck is too slow right now. Rainbow Mage was at its best when it was playing against decks like the Control Warrior, which was a bit slower. It's not slow right now. DJ Mana Storm has a 1-mana reduction. Actually, a pretty big change for this card. I was thinking for a while this is just irrelevant, but it's actually not irrelevant. Because on turn 9, well, turn 10, if you play this on turn 10, your DJ Mana Storm, and you have a handful of big spells, you can not only just play 1 big spell, you could play 2 big spells, because the first one will get increased to 1 mana. So you can play something like DJ Mana Storm into Tsunami, into Sunset Volley. And that is a lot of mana cheat and a lot of value on turn 10. So if you, as your big spell mage, can live till turn 10 to get your DJ Mana Storm and your Tsunami and your Sunset Volley in hand, you actually could get this huge swing turn. And that might be a big enough pull for people to play this deck. I don't think it will be. I actually think the Tsunami change from the last patch was actually a pretty big nerf to that deck. Mainly because the big problem about Big Spell Mage is that you're running only minions or cheaper minions to survive until you can play your big spells, and then play your cards that cheat the big spells out or repeat the big spells, that type of deal. Sometimes, though, you did just want to play your big spell to, you know, return some tempo back to your side of the thing, and Tsunami was so good for gaining tempo. 3/6 water elementals, as it once was, is actually a pretty big swing, especially with it freezing your opponent. Very good against Paladin, where they had, like, weapon attacks against you. Pretty good against Death Knight as well, who wanted to swing against you. With the Tsunami, though, at 10 mana now, you have to wait to 10 to just natively play this card, and it's so brutal to wait till 10. So I think, all in all, the juice isn't worth the squeeze on Big Spell Mage, but I definitely think this is an increase in the power level of the deck. Finally, we'll get to the wild cards now. I don't really play Wild, but I'm aware of some of the problems of these cards. Wild Paw Null was nerfed by 1 mana, it's now a 6 mana card. The issue with Wild Paw Null in Wild was that you would play the Twisted Pack, which generated 5 cards from other classes in your hand, temporary copies, and your Wild Paw Null would cost 0 mana on turn 1, which meant on turn 1 you could play a 3/5 Rush for free. And that is really strong, 0 mana 3/5 on 1. I guess you have to play a 1 mana card with it, so it's sort of like a 1 mana 3/5. Standard hasn't got there yet, so yeah, that was too big a tempo turn. I'm going to just jump over to Sorcerer's Apprentice now. This card has caused so many issues throughout the course of the game that they finally bit the bullet. They've decided that it's a card that will discount spells by 1, but they can't go less than 1, because the issue with this card was you would lead to infinite combos. You get like Antonides or something, you would generate a ton of fireballs, you would Molten Reflection, the Sorcerer's Apprentice sword, to get like 4 or 5 copies of it, and then your fireballs cost 0, and you can just blink down your opponent with an Antonides and kill them. It was basically just a problem card for combo decks, and this card has seen some nerfs. It once was a 2-mana card, it got put up to a 4-mana card, and eventually they've hit the point now where they're like, listen, we can't keep doing this, we can't like keep putting the mana cost up. The effect is just too strong, so we're going to bring the effect more in line with some sort of value creation, but not infinite value creation. And with that, they brought it back down to a 2-mana card. So it's a 2-mana 3/2 now, but your spells cost 1 less, but not less than 1, which interrupts this infinite combos. I will say, Radiant Elemental, watch your back, buddy, because there is a very similar card in Priest that doesn't have this effect, like the secondary effect. They've left it as the first one, and that can also cause some infinite combos. So do not be surprised, Wild Lovers, if Radiant Elemental is hit. The final card was Secret Passage, which got a 1-mana increase as well. I actually don't know how Wild is breaking this card in particular right now, or if they're just using it as a big refresh. Because I think part of the reason for this card was that you could play a Secret Passage into a bunch of draw cards and just draw through your deck really quickly. I actually don't know what, in particular right now, they were doing to break the game. But I'm sure it was fun. Anyway, that'll do it for this patch. I think overall the patch is pretty weak, to be honest with you. I don't think any deck will be viable that wasn't viable before. The only thing I will say is that there's possibly enough nerfs to some of the tier 1 decks that the tier 2 decks might come up a little bit a level. For example, I think Evolved Shaman maybe gets like an indirect buff from all of this because of the nerfs to the other decks out there. Yeah, that'll do it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, why don't leave a like, comment, and subscribe. I will check out the new patch with some decks, but again, apologies, I'm going away in like less than 12 hours, so it's going to be in just over a week's time that I get back to this. Anyway, have fun playing.